Bruce Levine is a clinical psychologist living in Cincinnati, Ohio. He's the author of Commonsense Rebellion, as well as America's Depression Epidemic. He's a regular contributor to Z Magazine, AlterNet, and the Huffington Post.
I'm Dr. Bruce Levine. I'm a clinical psychologist in Cincinnati, Ohio. Been in practice here for over 25 years. Written a few books. Last one is Surviving America's Depression Epidemic. Prior to that was a book called Commonsense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Lives from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. Write regularly for AlterNet magazine, Z Magazine, Huffington Post, Ecologist. My clientele is, I work with adults and families and teenagers, probably at any given time about a third teenagers. I work with folks who are, by and large, I would call them anti-authoritarian population, although my business would diagnose them with oppositional defiant disorder or attention deficit disorder or substance abuse. What I've found is a lot of the people who end up here and are comfortable with me that they are anti-authoritarians, usually without any kind of political consciousness. And often they are rebelling with self-destructive ways, and sometimes they're rebelling in a positive, life-affirming way, and they have no validation, they have no support. But for the most part, they're folks who are feeling utterly alienated by their surroundings, whether it's a school or it's a job or it's a society. And they've got a lot of pain off of that, and without validation of their pain and support, human beings tend to react and rebel often self-destructively. So they'll just drink 12 packs all day long with their pain rather than doing something that's actually going to transform their society or culture. It's just what all of us human beings do. When we get down low enough, we get down, when we're hurting enough, we don't really act sometimes in ways that are in our best self-interest. And I would say that there's three major ways that young people have been broken for many years in our society. One is television, two is schools, not necessarily in this order, and the third is my profession, the mental health profession. If you take a look at your average young person and their 24-hour school day, if you get rid of their whatever 6 to 9 hours in bed and their couple of hours of eating meals and personal hygiene, what are they doing in that day? What's their socialization? Well, 7 hours of school, 1 or 2 hours of homework, all right? And then the rest of their day is filled with television and video games. I mean, that's the major socializing forces in their lives, all right? So what does that teach them? What's going on for them? Well, there's a lot of horrible things that happen in school. One is kids lose their interest in reading, which is great for an authoritarian society. We have research that shows that the difference between kids who are in first grade versus when they move up to third and fourth grade is they're less likely to want to read books independently. So school, naturally, by forcing kids to read things that they're not really interested in and a whole bunch of other things like that, school actually makes it less likely people really are critical thinkers, curious, interested in reading, all those kinds of things. Overall, there's always exceptional teachers, but in general, that's what happens. Kids internalize the idea that the only way that you get an education is through some authority granting it to you, some authority's lectures, some authority's degrees, which is the opposite of the way people really get educated. Real education is through your own curiosity, through your peers. So school is an authoritarian-based pacifier in many ways. Then you move to the whole video game television area, especially television. Nowadays, kids on average are spending 4 or 5 hours a day in front of a television. They can watch it many different ways now. Besides just watching on a television set, there's alternative mediums to be able to watch it on their laptop, on their phone. So they're watching as much and more as ever TV. What are they learning there? Well, besides they're seeing shows, the vast majority of their programming is on stations that are owned by 6 corporations in America. The News Corp, Murdochs, and Viacom, and all these. Besides the content, they're learning something even worse. They're learning through these things that the only way that you get entertained is through some authority. All right, and they're learning that in their video games as well. Now, the video games are not quite as pacifying as at least if they're doing it with their friends. They're not in that kind of total zombie brainwave state that they are watching television. But either way, they're learning that the way you entertain yourself is through some authority. Here you got television and you got schools, both teaching kids that your education and your entertainment is via some authority, not through yourselves. For years, kids knew that you entertain yourself. After school, you'd go out and play with your friends, and you'd figure out stuff to have some fun. You didn't need any authority to entertain you. The third area that kids, not all kids are exposed to, but the kids who are most rebellious, they get exposed to my business, the mental health profession. And here in my profession, increasingly, the pacifying force is medication, right? Any kid who has got oppositional defiant disorder, which you get by often arguing with adults and often refusing to comply with adults, those are the official symptoms. You get treated with behavior modification manipulations or medication, or any kid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which means they're not paying attention to some teacher because they're boring, but they are willing to pay attention to things that are interesting for them, or if they're getting paid for it. These research shows that. That's most of these kids who are diagnosed with ADHD can pay attention to things that they are actually interested in. They just rebel against things that they're not interested in. And what our society, parents, children, media, accept the authority of these mental health professionals as being able to be the ones in our society to designate what personality types, what temperaments are mentally ill, disorders, and which temperaments are good, are healthy. And so I could tell you in 25 years of being in practice, no parent has ever dragged their kid into my office because the kid was too compliant. They were listening to teachers too well, or they were too conformist. Well, a society that would care about excessive compliance or fascism would care about something like that. But our society certainly doesn't care about that. Our society cares about making sure that we don't have kids creating tension, rebelling against the status quo. So that's what my profession does. It sort of functions as a sort of interpersonal police force in terms of designating certain temperaments, certain personalities as mentally ill or disordered. So again, we have the situation where you have as parents, society, kids, believing in some authority's view of what's mentally healthy, what's normal, and not their own gut. So those three major socializing forces for kids. What are the adults they see besides their parents? They see teachers, right? They see adults on television, and they see mental health professionals. These are the major socializing forces in their lives, and they're all teaching them to succumb to an authority's definition of education, of entertainment, of normality, of mental health. We have increasingly in our society so-called childhood disorders, which you never would have saw. It would be very, very rare, you'd almost never see 25, 30 years ago any kind of kid, any child taking any kind of psychiatric medication. Now this is common, right? I mean, I talk to kids all the time, and they tell me the statistics that they hear 10% or so of them are on psychiatric medications, totally wrong. They laugh. And most of the kids that I talk to, they tell me 25 to 30% of the kids in their schools are taking some kind of a ADD medication, Ritalin or Adderall or Addies as they call them, or they're taking some kind of a antidepressant, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft medication, or increasingly, more of them are taking antipsychotic chasers, with these drugs. They're taking these drugs called Risperdal and Zyprexa, which were really the replacements for these heavyweight tranquilizer drugs, Haldol and Thorazine, that went off patent, and the pharmaceutical companies created these so-called atypical antipsychotics, which are really not that much different than the old-fashioned ones, and they are creating enormous amounts of side effects. Many reasons why you have obese kids out there. More and more of American children are obese. Lots of reasons for that. But one of the least talked about ones is that so many of them are on these antidepressants, on these antipsychotics, which make it more likely that they're going to be obese. So all of these kids are being diagnosed with depression, with bipolar. the idea of any kind of kid being diagnosed with bipolar 25, 30 years ago was absurd. Kids were moody, right? Kids went up and down. Kids, would talk about feeling like suicidal one day and talking about like they're going to be, the president of the United States the next day. This was a kid kind of thing. But somewhere along the way, the psychiatry, pharmaceutical, industrial establishment, and make no mistake, they're proud partners. They don't hide this. There's a proud partnership between pharmaceutical companies and the American Psychiatric Association and the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They're proud partners with one another, that financially. And that between them, they decided that all kinds of kids were disorder, attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and a whole bunch of other kids were mentally ill, seriously mentally ill. And so now you have literally 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and given major heavyweight drugs, antipsychotic drugs. It's problematic enough that all these kids who weren't paying attention to boring schools were given speed, amphetamines, which is what Adderall is. Now they're given these heavy, sedating, zombifying antipsychotic drugs like Risperdal, like Zyprexa, like Seroquel. When you talk about diagnoses in psychiatry, there's almost zero reliability in any kind of diagnoses, because when you take a kid, I've seen many, many kids who've come in here diagnosed by some other doctor with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder. I've seen many, many kids, and I ask, well, how is this diagnosis made? And it turns out always that these diagnoses are made by these questionnaires that were handed out to parents to fill out or teachers to fill out. And routinely, I'll look at these questionnaires and I'll tell a kid before I even meet them, I'll say, I bet you I know which teacher that you really like. And of course, it's the one teacher that didn't diagnose the kid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what determines often, whether an adult perceives a kid with ADHD or any of these other diagnoses is, how much trouble that kid is giving them, how much they like or dislike that kid. They won't admit this, but I see this all the time. And so when you take a look at the reliability of paper and pencil subjective tests, it's going to be very low. And if you're a psychiatrist and you're an MD, it's the standard of care increasingly for almost everybody who's having some difficulty in life is to medicate them, to drug them with psychotropic drugs. Whereas if you're a PhD psychologist, you can't prescribe, except in a few states. Some psychologists have fought for prescription rights, but ordinarily there isn't that kind of a legal peer professional pressure if you're a PhD psychologist to medicate everyone, whereas if you are an MD psychiatrist, there is that pressure that you're actually doing something wrong because you're not putting some kid on speed, Ritalin, amphetamines, because the kid's not paying attention to school and he's paying attention to only things he's interested in. So in fact, you've got antidepressants, and this is not Bruce Levine saying this. This is finally now the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, black box warnings saying that these antidepressants, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, make it more likely that a young person, a kid, a teenager, young adult, will have suicidal thoughts than if they're not taking them. Okay, twice as likely, actually, if you take a look at the statistics. And so you have to ask, what kind of population buys into the fact that something is an antidepressant drug that actually makes it more likely you have suicidal thoughts and feelings? That seems to me more like a pro-depressant drug. But, it doesn't seem that way, I guess, to a lot of doctors out there who are being told that just because, the FDA approves something for something, you can use it. Once these drugs become approved, then there's every incentive for these pharmaceutical companies to want to use these drugs for as many things as possible. So, for example, way back, the whole antipsychotic industry, 25 years ago, drugs like Haldol or Thorazine or Trilofan, it was only a $200 million a year industry. It was very rare that people would be labeled as crazy enough or wild enough or psychotic enough to be medicated with these major tranquilizing drugs. But the drug industry discovered that we could use a lot of these newer drugs that don't have these drugs called Zyprexa and Risperdal and Seroquel, that we don't have to just use them for people who've been labeled psychotically agitated. We can use them for all kinds of people who we'd like to control a lot more. So some kid in a classroom. And so all of a sudden you went from an industry, a total industry of antipsychotic drugs being a $250 million industry, to Zyprexa a couple of years back, one antipsychotic drug alone topping $3 billion a year. Okay, by being used for all kinds of ways, including, chilling out people, old folks in nursing homes who, were understaffed, chilling out kids in classrooms here who were driving their teachers maybe a little bit crazy. So you can just expand the usage of these things. How does that zombify and pacify a population? Well, it's quite obvious. I mean, it's literally write pages out of Brave New World, Huxley's Brave New World. You've got a population where you've got giant pharmaceutical companies who are incentivized to create drugs that are used for more and more populations that are creating some degree of havoc. There's no institutions that are stopping that. The American Psychiatric Association, they work in financial partnership with pharmaceutical companies. National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, so-called a family group, they take millions of dollars from drug companies in grants. National Institute of Mental Health, which is the government agency. There's a revolving door of employment between the NIMH and the drug companies, same with the Food and Drug Administration. So there's no major institutions blocking this huge growth of drugs for people out there, which more it's become sort of almost mainstream to sort of see the similarities between Soma, the drug used in Brave New World, and the all the psychiatric drugs that are being used now. It's a drug to kind of drugs to kind of get people to chill out. I ask kids all the time, what's the actual effect on you of that ADHD drug, that Ritalin, that Adderall? All these other drugs, Dexedrine that they've used, what's the actual effect? Well, for many of them, and their parents and their teachers, agree it doesn't have any kind of effect in making them pay more attention. But for some of them, it does. Some of them, superficially, they look like they are paying attention. They're certainly more manageable and more compliant in a classroom. That does, in fact, happen. And those are the kids I'm really interested in. I say, well, what's happening? What's happening to you? And they're saying, well, what happens to me, Bruce, is like, well, I know at some level I'm just as bored as ever, but I don't care as much. And I'm just not as antsy or as agitated about being bored. Sort of in similar ways to people who use nicotine and smoke cigarettes on crappy jobs that they're in. They know they're just as bored as ever, but if they could get their nicotine hit, it takes the edge away from that. And so that's in lots of ways what psychotropic drugs do. Psychotropic drugs are illegal drugs or psychotropic drugs like marijuana and heroin. And psychiatric drugs are all psychotropic drugs. And what that means is that they're drugs that affect your neurotransmitters. Some of the famous neurotransmitters nowadays are serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, which, by the way, are the neurotransmitters that cocaine affects. And the same neurotransmitters that amphetamines affect, which are kind of synthetic cocaine. And that's what you give to kids with ADHD, these synthetic cocaine amphetamines. That's what they're being given. It doesn't have the same effect when you're taking something in pill form as it is when you're snorting it or when you're IVing something. But these drugs are very, very, very much similar. And almost all of these drugs that are psychotropic drugs, some of them are more likely to be uppers, right? The amphetamines, some of them are more likely to be downers. But what they all have in common is they disconnect you from what you're really feeling. And so you ask people all the time who are on these stuff, or you ask kids, it's like, they'll say stuff like, well, I think I used to care about that, and I think I still care about it, but I don't feel as much caring. I think I hate that person. I think I hate that guy who's mean to me, but I don't feel that hate as much. It takes the edge off of negative emotions. It takes the edge off of positive emotions here. And, for some people, they call that successful treatment. For guys like me, this is like Brave New World.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the sites, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.